Doing an Old Testament survey study, as you know, and you've got the lesson sheets in front of you. We're going to very end at lesson 8 is where we're going to be, and then jump into lesson 9 here this morning before we're done. We've been talking about Moses. We're talking about the various works and purposes that he had, talking about God's relationship with the Israelites, talking about the various events that came along with them. As you recall, Moses lived as an Egyptian for about how long? 40 years, went and was a shepherd next, right, for 40 years, and then comes back for the next 40 years and leads God's people. And so you can break his 120-year life down into those 3 40-year spans. He's come to Egypt. The plagues have all happened. Finally, Pharaoh relents and lets the people go, but then what's he do? Okay, changes his mind and chases after them. And when the people come and say, listen, by you releasing them, what are we supposed to do now? They were the ones doing all the work. And so they pursue them. They come to what barrier? Red Sea, right? And God does what? He parts it, allows for the Israelites to go across, and then uses that same situation to do what with the Egyptian army? To destroy it. So then the people after that do what in relationship to God? So in that moment, in that specific moment, what did they do? They praised him, worshipped him, honored him for what he had accomplished. But it doesn't take long before the obstacles. Generally, those obstacles had to do with living conditions, right? Water wasn't good, food wasn't good, situation wasn't good. It was living conditions that generally brought them to a murmuring, complaining state. And that you see that throughout their trek towards the Promised Land. But ultimately, they end up where? Before the law, maybe that'll help you understand. So that's Sinai, and you hear those initial 10 principles that are shared from the voice of God, and then Moses goes up on the mountain to receive the fullness of the law. And there's several chapters that address all those various things. We broke those down for you last week. And then ultimately, Moses, after a 40-day event up there with God and receiving the law, comes back. What's he find? All right, so they had grown impatient, had gone to Aaron. That's chapter 32. They had gone to Aaron. Aaron, without any reluctance, at least in the language of the narrative, it seems very cooperative. And he tells them to break the earrings off, break the gold off, bring it to him. They fashion a molten calf and begin to worship it and say, this is your God. And then it gets even worse in relationship to the behavior of the people in that celebratory, if you can use that kind of word, mode as it relates to it. Moses finally returns. He witnesses this, and what's he do? And breaks those tablets of stone. Ultimately, he's going to have to go back up on the mountain to receive those again. But what's God's reaction to all this? Okay, he wants to just be done and start a whole over. I'll just start this whole process over again. But Moses and God, in a sense, have a conversation. And basically, Moses makes the argument that if you do all of these things and bring us all the way out here, and then just destroy us, what will the enemy say? Yeah, he's not honest. Why would their God bring them all the way out here just to destroy them? And so it's not going to be the kind of situation that God had intended from the start. So that's where we are in the narrative. Go to chapter 33, if you will. Chapter 33 of the book of Exodus, as we pick up in our study in that chapter this morning. Exodus chapter 33, because there's going to be a renewal, if you will, of the covenant. And the covenant's origins are with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Which one of Jacob's children ends up Joseph, right? He ends up in Egypt. That's how they ended up there. They spend how long? 400 years, right? So they're down there 400 years, and then Moses comes on the scene and begins to leads them out of that Egyptian bondage. That's the narrative. So we've been a couple of generations and 400 years since the covenant was made with Abraham. And so we're going to see that in many senses restored here in chapter 33. Notice with me in verse 1. And the Lord said to Moses, Depart and go up hence, thou and the people which thou hast brought up out of the land of Egypt, unto the lands which I swear unto Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, Unto thy seed will I give it, and I will send an angel before thee, and I will drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Hittite, Perizzite, Hivite, Jebusite, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in the midst of thee, for thou art a stiff-necked people, lest I consume thee in the way. When the people heard these evil tidings, they mourned, and no man did put on him his ornaments. For the Lord had said unto Moses, Say unto the children of Israel, You are a stiff-necked people. I will come up into the midst of thee in a moment, and consume thee. Therefore now put off thy ornaments from thee, that I may know what to do unto thee. And so God wants to put them in a state of mourning. This isn't a time to wear your ornamental clothing and those kinds of things. This isn't a good time in God's relationship with His people, and yet He begins to reiterate and share with them that they ultimately will get into that promised land based on those promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But He's pretty disappointed and is uncertain in some senses in terms of His communication with them of what He should do as it relates to their decision making and choices that they've been making. But ultimately, He reestablishes that law. In chapter 34, in the beginning of chapter 34 of the book of Exodus, you begin to see Him reiterate some of those things. He tells him to use 2 more tablets of stone. We learned that there were 2 that he breaks. There's 2 now. They said, get 2 more, like to the first ones. And I will write upon these tables the words that were in the first tables, which thou breakest. So here's what's interesting. Though this circumstance occurs, God's law is not what? It's not going to change. You're going to go back up, and I'm going to give you the same information. Same law that God intended from the beginning. And He tells Moses to be ready in the morning and come up to the Mount Sinai and present thyself there to me on the top of the mount. And no man shall come up with thee, neither let any man be seen throughout all the mount, neither let the flocks nor herds feed before that mount. And that's the same kind of scenery that you saw the first time that He goes up on the mountain. Skip down into verse 10. So He said, Behold, I make a covenant. Before all thy people I will do marvels, such as have not been seen or done in all the earth, or in any nation. And all the people among which thou art shall see the work of the Lord, for it is a terrible thing that I will do with thee. Observe thou that which I command thee this day. Behold, I drive out before thee the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite. Take heed to thyself, lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land whither thou goest, lest it be for a snare in the midst of thee. And so, let's stop for a minute. So God reestablishes the covenant, and He reestablishes the fact that they're going to go into this land, but they're going to have to do what? Yeah, they're going to take it. And they're going to have to destroy the people that are there in order to accomplish that. Now, that's got some interesting kinds of conversations in some ways about it, but also want us to appreciate that in many senses, that punishment, if you will, that the Israelites will mount against all these other nations is also the condemnation of God against those nations and the choices and behaviors that they had chosen as it relates to that. But He's going to bring this destruction, and they'll destroy their altars, break their images. So what's going on there? A kind of idolatry. Okay, not honoring Jehovah, but idolatry. Cut down their groves, for thou shalt worship no other God, for the Lord whose name is jealous is a jealous God. Pretty powerful language there when you think about it. God is a jealous God. He doesn't appreciate, for lack of a better description here, He does not appreciate those who reject and deny Him. And He doesn't appreciate the fact that anyone would worship or honor anything that really isn't a God above Him. And so He's reiterating those things. But let me take you back for a minute. What did he tell them in verse 12? Yeah, be careful. Take heed, be careful, that when you get there, the temptation might be, well, let's try to make covenants and bind ourselves in treaties, and maybe this will be a more peaceful kind of thing, and that's what God intends. God intends for them to go in and take the land and possess it and rule over those people, and not try to find themselves in these kind of covenants, because if you do, what's the next phase? You'll begin to adopt what? Yeah, their practices, their thought processes. Once you enter into these binding covenants with these folks, then their culture, their thought processes, their in particular, their idolatrous approach to worship is going to be a temptation to you. And so that's not what God wants from them. Be careful. Don't go in there thinking we're just going to make nice with everyone and we're just going to make all these covenants and treaties and everything's going to be okay. There's going to have to be a greater responsibility. Notice verse 15. Lest thou make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go a whoring after their gods, and do sacrifice unto their gods, and one call thee, and thou eat of his sacrifice. God knows that if you allow for idolatrous influences to be around you, the temptation is that you will adopt those idolatrous influences. And so he says that we can't have that. He warns again, and thou take of their daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go a whoring after their gods, and make thy sons go a whoring after their gods. By the way, and we're a little bit early in the history. We've got to get through the period of the judges first. But ultimately, there's a king that comes along that's exactly the epitome of what God's warning them about. Who is that? That's Solomon. All right. Now, there are others along the path as well that we could illustrate that with, but he's a glaring picture of exactly why God gives this warning. Because exactly what he said here, when you begin to marry and pull into your family relationships all of these idolatrous influences, it won't be long till your sons are basically, and your daughters are basically involved in those very things. And how many altars and places of worship, because of the wives and concubines that Solomon had brought into his life, was he building and making in disrespect to the Creator of all things. And so, as wise as he was, he failed to even recognize one of the very basic principles that God established. Then what warning comes in verse 17? Yeah, don't do that again. Remember, that's not all that long ago. They just made that molten calf with all that gold that Aaron had collected. And so he says, don't do that again. No more molten calves. No more molten images. And then he wants them to remember the feast of unleavened bread. Shalt thou keep 7 days, thou shalt eat unleavened bread, as I commanded thee in the time of the month Abib. For in the month of Abib thou camest out from Egypt. All that openeth the matrix is mine, and every firstling among thy cattle, whether ox or sheep, that is male. And he continues to give them laws and instructions as it relates to how they're going to honor him and how they're going to make him the priority for them. And so, as he reestablishes the covenant, he also reminds them of the consequences of behavior. So the covenant relationship is still there, but the obligation of that covenant relationship is still there as well. And there may have been some failures, but you're going to have to get back to what that covenant meant originally. So how was God demonstrated? If you're looking at your questions there in question 12, how has God demonstrated the qualities listed in Exodus 34, 6, and 7? Anyone? No takers? Okay. All right. What would intermarriage with the Canaanites lead to in chapter 34 and verses 15 and 16? Idolatry. We're going to adopt those practices from those other nations. And then he said, discuss the immaturity of the Israelites and how have they behaved like children, and what should we learn from that? And so you see that, right? And you see that immaturity, in particular, in what one basic problem that recurred over and over and over again. Yeah, they murmured and complained every time there was an obstacle or a difficulty. Their mode of operation, if you will, was to murmur and complain in every moment of challenge and difficulty that will come along. They, for lack of a better description here, they've dodged a major consequence here. And I suppose in many senses it really reverts back once again to the fact that the original covenant made between Abraham and God, as it relates to the promises that were to come, are still sustaining the people. Because the people have failed enough over the time since Abraham that God could have easily and rightfully so just been done with this whole process. But He chooses to stay the course and maintain those original covenants and honor them, and strives to remind them of what the responsibilities are as it relates to those things. Thoughts or questions up to that point? And I'd really hoped to have gotten through all that by Wednesday, but I just didn't quite get there. And so let's talk, and Lesson 9 talks a little bit in the overview kind of approach, and maybe that's a good thing for us today, just to kind of summarize some of these things that we've been talking about, because there's a lot of history as it relates to the events and circumstances around Moses. But he makes this comment, the writer of the workbook does, that any nation must have the conduct of its citizens regulated by laws. There has to be some kind of orderly system, or you have what? You have chaos. And people may not always agree and or want to abide by those laws and guidelines, but the truth is, without them, there's chaos. And the same would have been with God's people. And so the law was necessary in that sense. And that law was necessary in relationship to God and His purposes to keep them in the path that would ultimately lead where? Well, what's the ultimate goal here? To get to Jesus, right? The ultimate goal is to get to Jesus. And that's the ultimate of heaven and salvation, and all that hinges upon the arrival of the Son of God in the flesh. And so this heritage and all of these covenants and all of these situations and everything that's happening is all intended to ultimately get us to Jesus. But you've got to have some guidelines and ways to govern yourself in the process. Who's the ultimate theocracy, if that's a word? But this theocracy that they have, who's ultimately in charge of all of this? God is. But He puts certain things in order that they might be able to have the kind of instruction and help along the way. And those laws just continue to mount. If you eventually you get into the book of Deuteronomy and you begin to see the further instructions and guidelines that God gives. When you get into the book of Leviticus, what are you going to talk about? The priesthood, right? And the law that relates to the priesthood and how they're going to govern. So God's code, His law, His instructions for His people is going to be vast, because it's going to have to cover their religious responsibilities, it's going to have to cover their national responsibilities, it's going to have to cover their protective responsibilities, their moral responsibilities, their responsibilities to strangers and neighbors, everything you can imagine. God is going to have to include within the testimony of that law. And so it becomes a pretty large document. I've always argued, and you may disagree with this, and that's okay, but I've always felt that when you examine the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, what to me you see the one of the stark contrasts between the two is that in the Old Testament, God didn't leave really anything to the thought processes of man. He was extremely, extremely, extremely detailed of exactly how, what, when, where. I mean, to the extremest of details of what kind of utensil they were to use, dip that right index finger into that, you will sprinkle. I mean, it is detail after detail after detail. The New Testament's very principle driven. The New Testament basically, in many ways, in the contrast, now there are details, there's specifics, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But the New Testament really gives a lot of principle-based instruction, and it says use the wisdom God has given you to make the application of those principles, and doesn't go into the specificity. And I'll give you the great example. They had a lot of feasts and things that they were to honor and observe over periods of time, and the instructions concerning those feasts and what they were to sacrifice and how they were to sacrifice it and what was going to happen, and even the tools, the utensils, everything given to them, told exactly what to do. Jesus gave us two specifics, and when it came to His memorial, and left the rest to us, right? He gave two specifics. He didn't say the manner in which you would distribute that among the people. He didn't say anything about the utensil or utensils that had to be used. He didn't describe any of those kinds of details in His memorial. He gave a couple of basic specifics that have to be honored, and then left it to man to decide how he would choose. He didn't tell us what time on the first day that you were to do that. He didn't give any of those kinds of specifics. He let man decide. Gave us the first day, and then said, figure it out. What works in order for your body of people to be able to gather upon the first day. It seems pretty obvious in Acts chapter 20 that when Paul preached till when? Until midnight. And that's that whole scene where old what's his name? Yeah, Eutychus falls out of that whole scene, right? That tells me that when did they gather upon the first day of the week? They were there in the evening. They gathered in the evening. I mean, I suppose you could argue that they started at 10:15 on Sunday morning, and Paul preached till midnight. But either he was really good, I guess. He probably could go to midnight. I don't want to shortchange the Apostle Paul. But I think we can fairly reasonably argue that their service didn't start at 10:15 on Sunday morning. If Paul preached, if that service continued clear until midnight. Now, anything's possible, I get that. But my point simply is that the principles in the New Testament are often given some specificity to it, and then man is left to make application of that. God didn't leave a whole lot of that kind of decision-making in the Old Testament law. Old Testament law, highly, highly, highly specific. New Testament, slightly different in the way that God communicated.
Law and grace is completely polar opposites.
Yeah.
They were the go-between from the world to God. And when that veil was split, grace was a whole new thing. A lot of people today just don't understand, the difference between law and grace. Grace is it's incredible. We do have a lot of liberty. I mean, it's not a fire escape,
right?
But it's just incredible, the ordinances that are no longer necessary.
Yeah.
And some people just don't get that. They don't understand the final, complete atonement for sins. Yeah. And they still think they have to do something else. They still think they have to give the tithe. They still, all that stuff. But it's just a completely different system.
Yeah. And I agree, Brian. I think that, and we do miss that point. And even New Testament writers are very specific that the handwriting of ordinances were in opposition to us in many senses. They challenged us in ways that we were unable to completely fulfill. That Old Testament law, we forget, sometimes had a purpose, and again, that purpose was to govern and to regulate those people until the time that Jesus would arrive. Once He arrives, no longer is there a physical nation that's peculiar to God. There is a spiritual nation that all men have opportunity to flow into through Jesus and receive the grace and benefit that He extends. It's a grace-driven law or covenant under the New Testament, which they didn't experience under the Old Testament law. The only thing they could hope for under the Old Testament law until Jesus come was to be perfect as it relates to it. Jesus come and changes the dynamic of that. And I think that's something we ought to appreciate and respect a little more maybe as that change occurs as it relates to it. Yeah. So there's a perfect example of a transitional thought. They had literal lamb, goat, dove, whatever sacrifices transition to New Testament, I'm the sacrifice. I sacrifice myself upon the altar of service to Jesus. Romans chapter 12 illustrates that on a daily basis. And so the sacrifice is no longer external in that I go and pick something to offer unto God, but every day I get up and choose to offer myself as a living sacrifice. So there's a transitional change that you see between the two laws.
The Jews couldn't keep that law then when they had a tabernacle or a temple to go to and do all the sacrifices. And I, in my mind, cannot figure out how they rationalize their religion today. They have no temple, they have no place, they do not offer animal sacrifices.
And that is a challenge sometimes to understand. And again, and it depends on what orthodoxy you're speaking of or about. Their mindset about that changes. There is a pocket that are still waiting for a Messiah, who believe he still hasn't arrived, and so it varies. But it is mind-boggling. Yeah, right. Yeah. The honoring of this, very little of that Old Testament law is completely being honored in those same fashions, because it can't be.
They try to keep little parts of the law. It's called the Hebrews Roots Movement, and they still say, they'll look into when Christ said, "Don't change one jot or tittle," and they'll take that to the extreme.
Yeah.
And that's no, they completely
Missed the point.
there.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions about that? Just that concept. Yep. Go ahead. Yeah, that's a good question, and obviously I think that's part of the priesthood system would have had to have been responsible, because remember, the priests ended up where? Once they get into the promised land, they divide it all up. The priests ended up where? That's a trick question, by the way, slightly. They went everywhere, right? They were everywhere. They didn't have a single location where all the priests lived. There's no land on a map. If you looked at the conquest of Canaan, there's no spot on that map that says Levi, right? Because the Levites, the priesthood, were scattered into the cities and places throughout the land, because they were going to have that responsibility to be the voice of the law and instructions of God, and that way it could disseminate unto all people. And I suppose that in many senses, in the same fashion that the patriarchal law passed, was simply a sharing of that knowledge in the Old Testament law among the people, and a continuing from family to family to family, generation after generation. And in many senses, I suppose that's maybe partly why you find moments where they've had major lapses, and then they come back in and they discover the ark, and they go, "Oh, we forgot all about this law," and they strive to kind of get back on it. It might explain a little bit why, after the 400 years of silence between the Old Testament law and the New Testament, you've got really basically among the Jewish population of Jesus' day, you've got just a system of traditions more than you have a system of avocation of the law as God had prescribed. And so when you're relying upon those human factors, it can get difficult. But by the way, that hasn't changed. Now, we have the benefit of everybody and anybody can have a hard copy or a digital copy or whatever in modern times of a Bible. But even the New Testament writer spoke of how God determined He would share His knowledge through earthen vessels. That men were always going to be in the equation as it relates to extending and sharing and providing the message of God to others. God always intended from then till now, really, to use men in that process of sharing that message. But I think probably that priesthood scattering is part of that ability to help all the nation maintain the connection to the law.
In Deuteronomy, it says to talk about them with your children.
Right.
Write them on your doorposts.
Right. So Deuteronomy 6 is a perfect example of that, of where they're encouraged to make sure that they convey and share and let others know about what the instructions of God were. So what does the term theocracy mean? We threw it out there for a second ago because it's in the... What? Okay, yeah, or one God rule was really the intent here. Yeah, and so God got ultimate rule is the intent of its use here. True or false? God gave laws to Israel through Moses over a span of at least 40 years. I think that's true, and I think here's what he means by that. You from the time that you start this process till the time Moses dies is 40 years. Part of that is the what? The wandering in the wilderness, and from the moment he has his moment on Sinai until he actually sends the people. And remember, Moses goes up and he dies, and then the people go and conquest the land. For that 40-year span, I think Moses is instructing and guiding and educating the people about what they're going to need to know before they go into Canaan. So from that perspective, that's why I would have marked true for just that question. But there was if you wanted to think of it in very specific terms, there was a specific moment in that on Mount Sinai where he receives the bulk, if you will, or the core of the law. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the tabernacle. We haven't spent much time discussing this, but let's talk just for a few minutes this morning, because this was an important priority. Before leaving Mount Sinai area, is to make sure they got this tabernacle as God had instructed. If you recall, when we did our quick survey of all these chapters and what was going on in each of them, you see God's instructions. Notice in chapter 31, God tells Moses first, calls a fellow by the name of Bezaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God. It's lowercase there, probably accurately so. I don't know that he's talking about the Holy Spirit entering him as so much as just his passion and desire to want to honor God and serve Him. But we could look at that. Just depends on translation. But at any rate, he's filled with the Spirit of God, and then he defines what that Spirit of God means, by the way, in the verse, and that's why I also make that point. He says he's filled with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. So that is the means by which, or what it was that God provided for him through the Spirit. So whether Holy Spirit direct and or Spirit in terms of His passion, irregardless of whichever conclusion you make, we know what the result was. And the result was his wisdom, his understanding, his knowledge, and his ability to be a craftsman was benefited by it. And he was able to devise cunning works, to work in gold and silver and brass, and cutting stones to set them, carving of timber, work all manner of workmanship. He chose another man by the name of Holiab, the son of that fella of the tribe of Dan. In the hearts of all that are wise hearted I have put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded thee. The tabernacle of the congregation, and the ark of the testimony, and the mercy seat that is thereupon, and all the furniture of the tabernacle, and the table and his furniture, and the pure candlestick with all his furniture, and the altar of incense, and the altar of burnt offering of all his furniture, and the laver and his foot, and the clothes of service, the holy garments for Aaron the priest, and the garments of his sons to minister to the priest, the anointing oil, the sweet incense for the holy place, according to all that I have commanded thee, shall they do. Detailed, 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 and that's not even all of it. Now, by the way, he's getting this when? When's this information coming to him? In terms of chronology. Yeah, well, he's on the mountain the first time, right? Chapter 32, he comes down off the mountain. That's that scene where they've made the molten calf. And so God's given him the instructions about how they're going to build this tabernacle, even prior to him going down and having that incident as it relates to what the Israelites had chosen to do in Moses' absence. And so it was key, right along with all those instructions about how they were going to govern themselves and how they were going to behave themselves and all the moral laws that He gave, God spends a lengthy period of time in His conversations with Moses about exactly how they're going to build this tabernacle, and not just how they're going to build it, but the what? There was two guys. And the who. God didn't even leave the who alone here. God said, here's a guy, and he's going to be responsible, and here's another guy, and I'm going to instill in them the wisdom and craftsmanship and knowledge that they need to fulfill the specific work of building this tabernacle exactly the way I want it to be built. And so God's not leaving anything to chance here. He's going to give them exactly what He wants, who's going to build it, how they're going to build it. It's going to be important for them to have the tabernacle. Now, the word tabernacle simply means what? Tent. The word tabernacle means tent. And you need a tent if you're going to do what? You're going to be traveling and moving. Now, here, just food for thought. We've got a few minutes here before we close this morning. So you need a tent if you need to be mobile. But he's yet to come off the mountain, and Moses doesn't even know what's going on. And we haven't even learned yet that God's going to make them what? Wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of the behavior. Now, who knows that? Here's the point. God knows it. God knows what's going on down there. Moses may be up on the mountain right now oblivious to what's happening down here below. And he's going to come down off of that mountain, and he's eventually going to be shown what's happening, and he's going to have his reaction to it. My simple thought here, friends, is this, that God, I believe, already understood what it was going to take. He already understood, and He's already preparing them. You need a tabernacle. We don't see the instructions for the tent. We go through the period of the judges. We go through the period of those two first kings before Saul and David, before we ever get to a conversation about building a permanent structure. There's going to be a lot of years come and go where they're going to need a mobile place by which to come and honor God and to worship Him and to have a place that's specifically intended for those purposes and the sacrifices that God wants for them. And to me, that just speaks volumes of the fact that God understood from the early stages here that they were going to be a mobile people for quite a while. Not instructions about how they're going to get into the promised land the next day and start constructing a permanent worship house for God. But here's instructions for a mobile tabernacle that they were given. Yeah. 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 And it will benefit them to have a permanent reminder of their connection to Jehovah. There it sits, right? And it goes everywhere we go, it goes. And is constructed exactly in the fashion that God would choose. Now, anyway, I just found it interesting, at least, that God obviously understood and knew that these were going to be a nomadic people for a period of time, and sets up for them a tabernacle place of worship. Yeah. Right. It's that original promise that keeps all of this going. This isn't the first time that God has said, I'm doing this because of what I made, the covenant I made.